Council Government Administration Committee A inquiry into finfish farming in Tasmania, consideration and noting. Ms Webb.
The honourable member for Nelson.
Mr President, I rise to move that the finfish farming in Tasmania report be noted. Having been chair of the inquiry, it's my pleasure to speak on this report today and contribute a final chapter, if you will, on this piece of work. The scope and duration of this work was not inconsiderable. Members may well recall at the time the report was tabled in May. Also tabled were, I believe, 14 folders of evidence taken during the inquiry. In light of that, and at the outset of my contribution today, I'd like to acknowledge and thank those who contributed to the work of this inquiry. Firstly, and most sincerely, to the Secretariat staff who supported the progress of the inquiry with patience and diligence. In particular, Jenny Mannering and Alison Scott. Jenny in particular, on whose shoulders the greatest burden fell. I would also like to thank the Parliamentary Research Service for its assistance, in particular the provision of a summary of submissions and the background paper on the industry, which you will see appears in the report. My deep personal thanks go to my fellow subcommittee members, in particular and especially the member for Hobart and the member for Mersey, who stayed for the duration and provided such thorough and thoughtful consideration and work on this. I would also, though, of course, thank previous members of the subcommittee, the previous member for Rosevears, Honourable Kerry Finch, and the member for Murchison, for their earlier participation and contribution as members of the inquiry subcommittee. An important thank you to note here too is to those who contributed evidence to the inquiry. Making submissions and presenting at hearings requires an investment of time, expertise and personal commitment. It's no small thing, Mr President, to ask, and the value of our parliamentary committee process, as all members here would attest, relies on the willing participation and contribution of many people providing valuable evidence. In light of that, I would also like to extend my personal thanks to the individual citizens, the community groups, the subject matter experts, the industry operators, the representative bodies and the departmental staff who invested of their time, expertise, insights and personal experience to the work of this inquiry. I am extremely grateful for all those contributions. Mr President, commercial farming of finfish commenced in Tasmania in the 1980s. It expanded to various areas across and around our state. It's become the most valuable primary industry in the state. The key legislation regulating the industry is the Marine Farming Planning Act 1995, the Living Marine Resources Act 1995 and the Finfish Farming Environmental Regulation Act 2017. Planning, regulation and promotion of the industry had rested with government. However, issues arose with very low dissolved oxygen levels in Macquarie Harbour, threatening the marine environment there and the protected species, and that at the time shone a light on some inadequacy in terms of regulation of the industry. In response to those concerns at that time, in relation to Macquarie Harbour, in 2016 the EPA assumed responsibility for the day-to-day regulation and environmental management of the industry. At the same time that crisis in Macquarie Harbour was playing out, with the EPA having to progressively reduce biomass caps to less than half what had previously been approved, we also saw the government double the 2030 growth target for this industry from $1 billion to $2 billion. We saw a contentious, at times, approval granted for further expansion of the industry into Storm Bay. And we saw, with that approval process, two members of the Marine Farming Planning Review panel resign, citing concerns about the panel's processes and the decision to allow the Storm Bay expansion to occur as it did. So, Mr President, I think it may be a fair observation to say that the success of the salmon farming industry in this state occurred at a pace that perhaps outstripped the regulatory framework around it. As a result, I think looking at the history of the industry here, it's hard not to have the sense that the regulatory framework provided by successive governments over time has always been playing catch-up to some extent. In fact, we heard something quite similar to that in the inquiry hearings from Francis Bender, the CEO then of Huon Aquaculture, who when commenting on the Sustainable Industry Growth Plan said this: "For many years the industry was growing. To be quite frank, in some ways we took the state and the government perhaps by surprise that we were quietly going about growing, and all of a sudden this industry was actually so valuable to the Tasmanian community. There wasn't really a plan in place." Mr President, I can understand the excitement at the success of this industry in our state as it powered ahead, looking for opportunities to develop and grow further. My sense is that the governments over the years have been enthusiastic supporters and maybe even cheerleaders for the success of this industry, but never quite caught up on comprehensive planning, regulation and effective environmental protection alongside that enthusiasm. Looking back over the timeline of events relating to the growth of the industry and the progress on the regulatory environment, one can't help but be struck by the impression that governments were often prompted to act when things started to go wrong to a degree that perhaps caused public fuss. Others may interpret those matters quite differently, and they are welcome to do so. But I would challenge anyone to make a case that, as a state to date, there has been what could be described as a proactive, comprehensive, government and community-led consideration of the presence and circumstances of this industry in our state. Which brings us to the establishment of the inquiry. In 2019, the situation was one where there were still unresolved issues in Macquarie Harbour. There was a government plan for a fairly massive expansion which appeared to be entirely industry-driven. There was a cloud over elements of the approvals for expansion into Storm Bay, and communities proximate to existing inshore salmon farms were increasingly becoming vocal in raising concerns over environmental damage and impact on community amenity from the existing industry. At that time, there had never been a Tasmanian parliamentary inquiry relating to the finfish farming industry. Some briefings were provided around that time to the Legislative Council members from various stakeholder groups, including industry, on matters relating to the current and future plans for the industry. As a result of those briefings, the members of Government Admin Committee A discussed the potential to hold an inquiry. Mr President, the focus of the inquiry was appropriately on the legislative and regulatory arrangements relating to the industry, matters which are determined by government and which establish the context in which the industry operates. I note here a very clear message that we heard from the industry operators during the inquiry, and that was that they willingly operate within and are prepared to comply with the regulatory environment and framework put in place by government. A proposal was put forward to undertake a parliamentary inquiry on this topic, and it was not about making judgments on the operations of private businesses or making recommendations to private businesses or industry groups. It rightly focused on the matters of government policy, regulation, decision-making and functioning, and it would make recommendations to government based on the findings that were made. It was in September 2019 that Government Administration Committee A resolved an inquiry be established to inquire into and report on planning, assessment, operation and regulation of finfish farming in Tasmania. Shortly after that, at her request, the member for Rumney was discharged from the inquiry, and therefore a subcommittee of Government Admin Committee A was formed to continue the inquiry under those existing terms of reference. Mr President, I take a moment to note here that the progress of the inquiry was interrupted on numerous occasions by circumstances beyond the control of the subcommittee members. Due to the prorogation of Parliament and the operational strictures placed on the subcommittee resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, the activity of the inquiry was paused for a period of approximately 4 months between April and August 2020. an interim report was prepared in April, outlining progress made prior to that interruption. When re-established in August 2020, the Honourable Kerry Finch was no longer a member of the subcommittee, having retired from Parliament at the 2020 Rosevears election. On the 20th of March 2021, the inquiry was again interrupted for approximately 4 months by the prorogation of Parliament as a result of an early Tasmanian election. The inquiry was re-established on the 6th of July 2021 with a membership of 3, myself, the member for Hobart and the member for Mersey. At that time, the member for Murchison had resigned from the subcommittee. On the 5th of April 2022, the inquiry was interrupted, Mr President, for, yes, the hat-trick, the third time, for a period of 1 month by the prorogation of Parliament following the resignation of Premier Gutwein. Quite a number of interruptions, to say the least. And Mr President, while our numbers had shrunk to 3 on the subcommittee, we were committed to our task and willing to invest a great deal of time and consideration to completing the work of the inquiry. All up, I believe the formal deliberations of the subcommittee in relation to this inquiry amounted to approximately 190 hours of time. And of course, that does not include the many additional hours of work devoted by members of the subcommittee in preparation for those meeting deliberations. Prorogations and external delays aside, this was still a lengthy inquiry and always was going to be. A factor in the length of time taken for the inquiry was its sheer size, both the scope of the terms of reference and the quantum of evidence taken. The subcommittee received 225 submissions, which are published on the inquiry webpage and appear listed in the report in Appendix A of the report. Public and private hearings were held in Hobart over 4 days in February 2020, across 1 day in Burnie in February 2020 and via video conference in April 2020. 29 witnesses gave verbal evidence to the subcommittee during those hearings. The inquiry resumed public hearings over 2 days in September 2020 and further days in October and November that year. 9 witnesses gave verbal evidence to the subcommittee during those hearings, including second appearance from both the Department and the EPA. I would like to mention here and thank both the industry operators and the community groups who provided site visits to members of the subcommittee. A number of site visits were made in the course of the inquiry, and it's incredibly helpful to have those visits be facilitated to assist in our better understanding of matters that were raised in the course of the inquiry. So I thank those groups for that. Mr President, while the makeup of the subcommittee and the progress of the inquiry were subject to change across a 2.5 years duration, there were also a number of notable changes in the policy and industry context for finfish farming in Tasmania during that period of time. And those included a government-announced review of the salmon industry growth plan, and a government-announced 12-month moratorium on increases to leased farming areas from September 2021. Change of name from the Department of Primary Industries, Parks, Water and Environment, DPIPWE, to the Department of Natural Resources and Environment Tasmania, NRETAS. An announced intention to increase the independence of the EPA Tasmania as a statutory authority. The sale of Petuna Aquaculture to New Zealand company Sealord Group. The sale of Huon Aquaculture to Brazilian company JBS, and the even more recently now announced sale of Tassal to Canadian company Cook. We encourage people to engage with the report of the inquiry, with these and any other changes that have occurred over the period of time that the inquiry has been undertaken, with these things in mind, knowing that we needed to operate on the basis of the evidence that we received, and while we noted those changes as they occurred, the report reflects the evidence received. And so, speaking of the evidence we received, before I go into some detail on some of the matters through the report that I'd like to discuss today, Mr President, I would like to take the opportunity to highlight some key themes, if you will, that I believe emerged in evidence to the inquiry. I think it's useful because I think there were some very clear themes throughout, and they're important ones that we ask ourselves if they've been heard and noted. The themes that I would mention are a theme about independence. and about the need to have things independently undertaken and verified and presented in a range of ways in relation to this industry, particularly around, say, scientific evidence bases and things of that nature. Another theme was around transparency, in terms of particularly information, data and decision-making processes. Another theme would mention is that of accountability, explicit accountability clearly in processes and decision-making. Another one would be a theme that emerged around the need for clarity about how we balance considerations in this state, particularly considerations across economic, environmental, social and cultural matters. And a final theme that I would point to is one of the centrality of community input and participation that many citizens would expect to be part of important processes and decision-making that's undertaken in relation to key public areas of our state. You'll note, Mr President, that all these themes relate to process. These themes are all connected to how things are done. These themes all relate to the inescapable fact, I think, that there's a strong perception of what we might even call regulatory capture of government by vested interests in relation to this industry. And to whatever degree that this perception is accurate, it does exist. We saw it and heard it through evidence to the inquiry. It's discussed in the public domain regularly, and I don't think it benefits us to pretend that it's not there. Mr President, I think this means that building a social licence for this industry, if it's to be achieved, will only occur when this perception is effectively acknowledged and government planning and regulatory frameworks are reconstructed to dispel any past failures that led to that perception. I think a key reason that the themes I've mentioned are important to hear and also understand and respond to in good faith is that this is an industry that does operate on our public waterways. Our public waterways are meaningful to the Tasmanian community in a wide range of ways. They're valued for all manner of activities undertaken in and on them. Beyond their use, our public waterways are valued intrinsically by Tasmanians too, as a fundamental and precious asset of our natural environment. Many Tasmanians, particularly those that live near the coast, connect strongly with that. For some Tasmanians, including some Tasmanian Aboriginal people, their connection to the coastal environment is cultural and spiritual also. So when it comes to our much valued public waterways, the primary responsibility of government, I believe, must be to prioritise careful stewardship, clearly led by the best interests, the aspirations and the will of the community, while also being mindful of preserving that intrinsic value and access for future generations. Any perception of prioritisation or special consideration being given to a commercial corporate interest in relation to the use and the potential damage of our public waterways is anathema to what I think is the primary responsibility of government. I think that equates to a failure of government to lead and strengthen our community. I think instead it risks driving hurt, division, mistrust and opposition. That's an unfortunate situation for us to find ourselves in this state, I think, in relation to this industry. However, Mr President, I don't regard this to be an irredeemable situation. Our intent with this inquiry was to be constructive in our approach and to look for positive opportunities to move ahead. In the report, in the Chair's foreword, the inquiry identified constructive opportunities that we had observed during the course of the inquiry. And I'm going to reiterate those here. Firstly, it was our observation that there is support for a sustainable fin fish farming industry in Tasmania if areas for expansion and growth targets are transparently developed and evidence-based. We noted there appears some common ground in regard to a pause on further expansion of the industry in the form of new farming areas or increased stocking limits until consultation and planning has occurred. We observed that the online data portal will be integral to delivering public confidence in the industry. However, the portal, as it is now, requires significant improvement and expansion in scope and functionality through consultation with all stakeholders. Legislative reform was a constructive opportunity that we identified to improve regulation and establish further mechanisms of transparency, accountable decision-making and community participation. Increased resourcing of the EPA is an opportunity that would enable more comprehensive independent monitoring, investigation, enforcement and reporting relevant to the industry and contribute significantly to improved public confidence. And finally, learning from other jurisdictions. We identified there's an opportunity for greater financial return to Tasmania from this industry. And one final observation I would make, and this was a very clear one that I want to state here. We observed that this is an industry that has demonstrated a willingness to adapt and to innovate, to reduce environmental harm. It is an industry that acknowledges the need for continual improvement, to be sustainable, and it states its readiness quite plainly to work within the regulatory framework set by government. I applaud the industry for that. It wasn't something we heard a number of times. Mr President, given these constructive opportunities, I personally believe a way forward can be navigated if, in good faith, there's a genuine effort made to build the social licence of this industry, primarily through restoring confidence in the government's role of planning and regulation. I certainly thank the government for providing a detailed response to the inquiry report and recommendations. It was useful to receive the response and have a week or so now to consider it before making today's contributions. The response document indicates that the government monitored the progress of the inquiry over its duration and itself reports significant progress on many of the issues the inquiry identified. The government response points to activity that is currently being undertaken and links that activity to recommendations made by the inquiry. In some cases, I would agree those links are straightforward and welcomed. In other instances, while the government may regard an action it's taking as fulfilling a recommendation from the report, there would be some discussion, I think, over whether the activity is fully aligned with the detail and the intent of the recommendation. And some of those I'll discuss in some more detail as we go through some elements of the report. In many instances, the government response points to processes that are either still in progress or yet to begin. In these cases, we're yet to see if the intent of the recommendation is fulfilled once that process plays out. And in particular, I reiterate that in every instance, increasing public confidence and building a social licence for the industry will not just rest on what the government does, but crucially on how it is done. Mr President, it's difficult if there isn't clear acknowledgement of failures of the past, especially failures of process, to move forward constructively. Because without fully recognising what may have been done poorly in the past, the likelihood is that we lurch ever onward and risk repeating those same mistakes. I hope that's not the case for this topic and this industry and the efforts that are currently underway. Mr President, I'd like to speak on some matters from each of the terms of reference. It will not be possible to discuss in detail all matters covered in this report. And I do not mean to downplay the importance of any matters that I may omit at this time from my contribution. I certainly encourage those who are interested to read the full report. Term of reference 1 of the report was this: the implementation of the Sustainable Industry Growth Plan for the salmon industry and its impact on commercial finfish farming operations and local communities, including A, data collection and publication, and B, progress in the development of an industry-wide biosecurity plan. The government released that salmon industry growth plan in 2017, which the department says in its submission, and I quote, sets out how the government will support the industry to achieve a revised target of becoming a $2 billion a year industry by 2030. The plan included a map which indicated grow and no-grow areas around the coast of Tasmania. Questions were raised in many submissions over the lack of comprehensive consultation, especially with non-industry stakeholders, in the preparation of that plan, and the lack of a transparent evidence base for the areas identified for industry expansion and the overall growth target of $2 billion. Those concerns were summed up, I think, probably most succinctly in a submission from independent scientist Christine Cogenauer, where she said, first and foremost, the plan was not developed in consultation with the community, with commercial fisheries, or even with the scientific community. The SIGP, the plan, appeared as a draft for comment in August-September 2017, and there's no description in the plan about how it was drafted or even the rationale for the proposed expansion target of $2 billion by 2030. Consultation occurred afterwards, not as part of the process, and many of the valid concerns raised were proposed to be addressed through regulatory change, improved science and information and/or adaptive management. Unfortunately, this has not yet eventuated. There is no evidence that the SIGP, the plan, was based on scientific, environmental or socio-economic investigations. In particular, what was the basis for the grow and no-grow areas? What was the basis for the expansion targets and timelines, and why are they considered to be sustainable? Were any other considerations included, such as the value and location of prime recreational and commercial fishing areas and potential impacts on areas of high biodiversity? That was a summing up of a number of concerns that we heard from a range of stakeholders. The inquiry sought to find out more about the development of the plan from the evidence in submissions and at hearings. We heard that the department carried out what it considered to be a comprehensive consultation process in the development of the plan. While evidence was received that scientific data and information was used in the development of the salmon industry growth plan, the extent of that evidence base is unclear, because it was never publicly available or shared. We also heard that the department understands the $2 billion growth target in the 2017 plan to be aspirational, a policy decision by government at the time. The department's public consultation material relating to the plan did not provide a rationale for that growth target of $2 billion. Apparently, the government's $2 billion growth target was based on progress made towards the previous target of $1 billion and from discussions with finfish farming industry regarding likely growth opportunities. On the other hand, we heard finfish companies indicating that they had limited involvement in the development of the salmon industry growth plan at that time. Inconsistent views were presented between finfish farming operators and also the department as to the role the industry played in setting the $2 billion growth target. I thought what we heard from the industry operators on their views of the plan was really quite interesting. Mr President, in response to a question I noticed about Petuna's involvement in the development of the salmon industry growth plan, this comment was received. And I quote, Petuna had minimal involvement in the development of the government's sustainable industry growth plan. It's our understanding that this work was conducted by the government, largely independent of industry consultation. At the time, the regulation of the industry had been the subject of a Senate inquiry and Four Corners investigation, sparking significant community scrutiny led by environmental activists. It would not have been appropriate for the industry to play an active role in determining its own future growth in the state. An interesting view. And again, similarly, we heard from Mark Ryan, CEO of Tassal, who provided a summary of Tassal's involvement in the development of the plan. And I quote from that hearing transcript. At that time, plenty of leases in Tasmania were unutilised, so it was simply a matter of filling those leases and optimising what we did have. We knew we would get to a point where they would be optimised and new frontiers would be needed. We engaged with the government as an industry to talk about what that might look like and how that might evolve. Much to our surprise, when the growth plan came out, we really did not have a lot of play into that process. A lot less than I thought we might have, because we had seen many of the areas where we were growing fish, so we knew where the better areas were to grow fish. And then from Francis Bender, CEO of Huon Aquaculture at the time, the following comments on the plan, the growth plan. the ones I quoted earlier, Mr President, for many years the industry was growing. To be quite frank, in some ways we took the state and the government perhaps by surprise that we were quietly going about growing, and all of a sudden this industry was actually so valuable to the Tasmanian community. There wasn't really a plan in place. There was legislation and environmental management of us, but not a strategic plan. The fact that we have a plan now is great, but the plan needs to be constantly reviewed, just like some of the issues, like the portal and those sorts of things. The whole thing just needs to be constantly reviewed. She went on to say, we need to work together in whatever way is appropriate to make sure that the government understands the requirements of the industry and the responsibilities that we have and what the community wants from living in this state. Mr President, I think that's a significant acknowledgement from Mrs Bender, that the planning processes have to explicitly include consideration of what the community wants from living in this state. I don't believe that has been one of the starting points for such planning to date. I don't believe that an explicit conversation has been led or invited by government with the community around that, but I think it's admirable that that was recognised as an important way forward. A key feature of the plan was the grow, no-grow map, indicating areas for further expansion around the Tasmanian coast. This map gave rise, Mr President, to community concern, quite frankly, due to the perception that it was a definitive planning document. A succinct comment came from Chris Wells, a community member with experience in aquaculture development planning in South Australia, and he said this: the Tasmanian Government Aquaculture Growth Plan is essentially a map of the state with red dots for sites stuck all over it, except for the parts of the East Coast where people's objections have run too strong. The only considerations in this plan are convenience for business owners, farmers and politics. Now, that's obviously a comment that's come from a certain perspective, and others will have information beyond that that would flesh out how, in fact, that map came about. As it turns out, the department, we heard, regards the Salmon Industry Growth Plan, including the Grow, No-Grow map, as a strategy document, and apparently it was not designed to be definitive on future growth areas. It was confirmed that in the creation of the map, there was no comprehensive marine spatial planning process undertaken to identify areas suitable for sustainable industry growth. This may be because at the time there was no legislative basis or requirement for comprehensive marine spatial planning, including the identification and planning for future industry growth areas. Nicole Summer, who's the Principal Lawyer of the Environmental Defender's Office, highlighted the importance of spatial planning in determining sustainable growth areas for this industry, where she said, "We have made recommendations about spatial planning, which is what needs to happen. It's a very opaque planning term, but it means you identify areas where you can have salmon farming and there will be limited environmental risk and adverse community outcomes by doing the science in identifying those locations. Then we should identify what are no-grow areas, and that should guide how the industry develops. That science needs to be done up front, and that's not how the industry plan, growth plan operates, to my understanding." Interestingly, again, Mark Ryan, CEO of Tassal, made the following comments in relation to Tassal's view of the map in the growth plan. He said this: "One of the things we were advocating at the time before the growth plan came out was the whole concept of spatial planning. To look at this not just from an area where you could grow fish, but to look at communities in areas where the industry was wanted and where we could continue to grow and prosper. We've always taken that really seriously, but we said to both sides of government, you need to do this process in an informed way. You need to go out to communities and engage with them." And further, Mr Ryan compared the process to his company's experience in Queensland. He said, "Government put out a map that really did not have a lot of relevancy to anyone. I guess what we experienced with Queensland was that they did a whole spatial planning exercise. They went up and down the coast of Queensland. They went to all the communities. They identified both adequate areas to grow and then also adequate areas that communities wanted industry, and they had a match." Mr President, there's no getting away from the fact that the 2017 Salmon Industry Growth Plan and its associated growth target and grow, no-grow map was problematic. The process used for its development was flawed, including the fact that it presented no evidence base or rationale to justify the goals and outcomes it proposed. That plan, in my view, probably caused more harm than benefit to the industry in the long term, and it positioned the government and the industry at odds with significant elements of the community. It's hardly surprising that submissions received by this inquiry expressed support for a pause on expansion of the fin fish farming industry until such time that issues and concerns raised in relation to planning and regulation of the industry are addressed. As a result of what we heard in regards to that salmon industry growth plan from 2017 and its associated parts, the inquiry made some key recommendations. The first recommendation was that a revised salmon industry growth plan be developed as one aspect, this is important, Mr President, as one aspect of an overarching marine plan for Tasmania through a process that includes comprehensive stakeholder consultation, is informed by assessment of environmental, social and recreational values, and has a transparent evidence base. That picks up on a lot of those concerns about process. It's not just what you do, Mr President, it's how you do it that's also equally important. Recommendation 2 was that the government should ensure a revised salmon industry growth plan specifies potential fin fish farming areas identified through a process of marine spatial planning and sets an industry growth target for those areas which is transparently developed, sustainable and evidence-based. And I'd also point to recommendation 4. That one was that there be no further expansion of the fin fish farming industry in the form of new farming areas or increased stocking limits until the revised salmon industry growth plan is finalised, as per the recommendation 1. I note that in September 2021, the government announced the development of a new 10-year salmon plan. Excuse me. The government describes a process for the development of this new 10-year salmon plan, which I hope rectifies the failure of process that occurred in the previous plan. Certainly, in evidence received in hearings, there was what I observed to be a fairly stubborn resistance from the department leadership to admitting that there was anything lacking in the development of the previous plan and to any need for doing things differently. I think that's unfortunate. I think it would be very constructive if there's a receptivity always to thinking about how we do things in an improved way if there's been clear issues with the way it was done in the past. I think it remains to be seen whether the government has heard, understood and accepted that there were failures in the previous process and whether it has fully rectified those issues. I think a really good starting point was the establishment of 4 principles to guide the development of the new 10-year salmon plan, which is planned to be enacted next year in 2023. Those 4 principles were: 1, there'll be no net increase in leased farming areas in Tasmanian waters while the plan is under development. I think that is particularly helpful that that was made explicitly clear and an intention of the government while it was undertaking this planning process. I note that the development of the plan is taking probably longer than initially anticipated, and the government has extended the intention to have no net increase in farming areas through to when the plan is completed, so beyond the initially announced 12-month period. I think that is appropriate and respectful and in the spirit of the intention of putting a pause while planning happens. I think it's unfortunate. I know the government and the minister have received some harassment even from other parties about their extension of that moratorium and received questions even in this place on it. I think it's a good decision from the minister and from the government to be extending that pause. I think to do otherwise would be a real slap in the face for the intention with which it was established in the first place. The other principles of those 4 principles to guide the development of that new 10-year salmon plan, second one is around innovation with future growth lying in land-based and offshore fat salmon farming. I think that's an excellent explicit statement around what is generally accepted to be the future direction of the industry as it continues. The third one is world's best practice through continuous improvement. Again, a very important principle to have stated from the outset. And the fourth principle being strict independent regulation. And again, I think that picks up on one of those themes I mentioned earlier around independence being important. One of the things that I don't see picked up on there, and I wonder about in relation to progressing forward with a new 10-year plan, is that broader question of a marine plan for the state. The government says that that's separate to the development of the 10-year salmon plan. The government's conducting a review of the Living Marine Resources Management Act, 1995, and that's fine. That's a good thing to be reviewing, that piece of legislation. It does provide the legislative framework for the administration, management and protection of living marine resources and the marine environment. I think, though, that what we were calling for in an overall marine plan for Tasmania was beyond just reviewing the legislation and then updating the legislation, but then looking to put an overarching planning process in place under which would sit things like the new 10-year plan. So I don't see response to that recommendation yet, but I see lots of positive signs on some elements of the development of the new plan. I'm going to mention here, Madam Deputy President, recommendation 3. Recommendation 3 from the report was this: to develop a plan in consultation with industry, scientific and community stakeholders to reduce inshore finfish farming sites, with priority given to ceasing operations in sensitive, sheltered and biodiverse areas. Now, the government does support in principle, apparently, a consultative process with industry and scientific and community stakeholders to develop a policy setting that encourages exploration offshore and land-based into the future. That's fine. I think we've got agreement on that. But the government, in its response, in a nutshell, isn't picking up on this recommendation that was made around looking ahead to a plan to reduce inshore finfish farming sites in this state. While they do say that the approach they are taking forward may realise an overall reduction in those sites, they're not prepared to engage in a process by which to plan for that to occur. From the government's response, and perhaps if I've mistaken this it can be clarified, it seems that the government regards that those current inshore sites are sustainably operated and they are subject to best practice environmental management and regulation by the independent EPA. The government in their response notes that there's provisions in place for the EPA to regulate and manage environmental performance of those existing inshore finfish lease areas, and that the director of the EPA can and has previously taken action to reduce the scale of finfish farming in those areas, like what happened in Macquarie Harbour, when there's an indication to do so. Unfortunately, Madam Deputy President, the core problem here is that I believe there are justifiable questions over whether some of these inshore operations, in relation to the assertion that they're being sustainably operated under best practice management and regulation, is accurate. That might be the intention, especially once some of the standards and currently under development processes and new requirements come into regulation. But at this time, and certainly in times past, there are significant question marks over some of these sites, including, as an example, we most recently have seen a report released from IMAS on the Tassal operation in Long Bay. Now, I know this is a sensitive topic to talk about today. I'd already written it in, so I'm going to continue. We know that after a long period of not being used, operations were resumed at that site. There was limited reassessment of its suitability, is our understanding, which didn't include public consultation. There have been considerable concerns raised at the environmental impact that is now occurring in that Long Bay area, especially in relation to algae. It seems that the IMAS report recently released has indicated that the finfish farm operations in Long Bay are having an impact beyond the allowable perimeter. Now, I just can't really see how we wouldn't be asking ourselves, if we had a blank slate under contemporary marine spatial planning approaches and with contemporary understandings of best practice, sustainable environmental management, would we choose that site as a site for finfish farming operations? I am not in a position to say yay or nay to that. But we do know that the accepted understanding is that the future direction of this industry is more appropriately located in offshore sites and land-based operations, not in sites like Long Bay. So this recommendation made, I believe, is a reasonable prompt for the government to reconsider, in consultation with industry, scientific and community stakeholders, making a plan to reduce finfish farming operations in areas that are contentious and may well otherwise be now considered unsuitable or undesirable as areas for this activity. Madam Deputy President, another area that fits under term of reference, one that I'll touch on, is around data and information. Independence, credibility and public release of data and information relating to the industry is important to deliver transparency and accountability, to improve public confidence in the industry and its effective regulation. Clearly communicated to the inquiry was the fact that the finfish industry operators regard their collection and publication of data to be comprehensive. It's a matter of pride for the industry that they gather and publish a great deal of information about their activities and in some cases go beyond requirements set by government and others. However, alongside this, concerns were raised that the monitoring, collection and publication of data is not sufficiently comprehensive, transparent and/or independent from the industry. In relation to the finfish farming industry, there's a great deal of complexity in regards to who collects data, the regulatory environments in relation to data and where data is published and made publicly available. Data and information relating to the industry is collected by a whole range of entities. The industry itself, the EPA, the department, independent consultants, scientific research institutions, just to name probably not all of them. Data and information and reports may be done because it's regulated they be done, or they may be voluntary, or they may be undertaken independently as part of scientific investigations. And through all those processes, they're published across a range of different sites. The result being it can be incredibly hard to find, compare, interpret and assess data and information about this industry. Currently, published data on the finfish farming industry is not always presented on company or government websites in a way that's clearly connected to the relevant regulatory requirement. And publicly available data and information relating to companies and individual fish farm operations lacks consistency. Data and information on key matters of interest in relation to this industry, salmon biomass, pollutant loads, localised impact in relation to finfish farming industry, not always publicly available. And when information on them is sought, what we heard reported to us is that requests to the companies or the EPA have been denied in the past, rejected on the basis of commercial in confidence, or diverted through cumbersome right to information processes. I think, Madam Deputy President, there's rightly an expectation from members of the community that there should be timely public release of information relating to the finfish farming industry. I think what we heard reported to us was that there are good examples of this. That other aquaculture farming regions outside Australia stipulate and regulate the publication of industry data to a greater degree than occurs in Tasmania and more effectively in terms of informing their communities. This is an area where there's a great deal of opportunity for improvement. And I know that the government will point to a move towards that improvement by highlighting the data portal. And indeed, as we were embarking on the inquiry, the data portal was just coming into existence. So we know that transparency of information is important. It comes back to one of those key themes: transparency, accountability, and links also to independence, because people like to know where data's come from and that it's come from a source that doesn't have a vested interest in its presentation. I think data and information can dispel misunderstandings, it can empower community members, it can be a source of pride for industry, and it means that you can have informed participants in planning and decision-making processes. So the Salmon Industry Growth Plan back in 2017 included the commitment to establish a web portal hosted by IMAS to present environmental data and information relating to the industry. The government apparently, it was reported to us, consulted with industry in regard to that portal and the data it should contain. But at the time, community and non-industry stakeholders weren't consulted. It was subsequently decided that rather than IMAS, the department would host the portal, and it would focus solely on regulatory compliance data. And this is where things come unstuck a bit. The idea of a portal was to have a one location where people could go to access the information they needed about the industry and to keep abreast of what was available through data and information around industry operations. But what we heard was that as the idea of the portal was further developed and it was removed from IMAS in terms of a location to the department, we heard from the department in hearings that, and I'll quote from Fiona Bourne, the decision was a decision of government of the day. When it started to look at the implementation of developing a salmon portal, it realised, and it was clear, that there was already in the public domain a significant amount of information from the EPA on its website about environmental compliance and management. IMAS had a quite extensive website of its own where its science was at. The gap, what was missing, was more in the operational and regulatory space. The decision was to increase the transparency around there because those are the data that are needed to be made more visible. As the data rests with the department, it was more appropriate that the portal rested with the department as well. So while the department the department put the portal into the public domain, it went live in late 2019. And at that point, we heard that the department regarded that they had met the commitment in the growth plan. But unfortunately, because it had actually just become yet another of a list of sites presenting information to the public, it didn't actually, I believe, fulfil its original intent that had been articulated in the Salmon Industry Growth Plan. And I think we're still waiting for it to fulfil that intent. It didn't solve the problem of disparate locations and inconsistent and non-comprehensive presentation of data. There's still no one-stop shop, I believe. So we've made some recommendations in the report relating to improvement of the data portal. It does hold a lot of promise. It could be made to be even more functional and useful than it is now. It could become more of an assistance to public confidence through transparency and openness. To do that, it needs to be engaged with not just by industry and government, but by all stakeholders. And it needs to think how it can fulfil that original intent of a one-stop shop to some extent. The government has flagged that as part of the development of the 10-year salmon plan, changes to the portal and other transparency measures will be considered. And that's really promising to hear. I welcome that. I'm heartened to hear it. Of course, it's an intention, so we'll have yet to see how that plays out and the degree to which it delivers on the intended and hoped for outcomes around such a portal. Deputy President, biosecurity came under that first term of reference, and I'll just mention that briefly. There's much that could be said around that, and there's a lot of evidence presented in the report that if people have an interest in this area, I encourage them to have a look at. Biosecurity clearly is fundamental to the success of this industry in Tasmania. The development of an industry-wide biosecurity plan, I believe, is still yet to be completely finalised. However, industry operators have always been quite proactive in introducing biosecurity measures on a voluntary basis. Of course, it's in their best interests too. It's in their commercial interests to have effective and robust biosecurity. We've had excellent information presented in this state through a global symposium around biosecurity back in, I believe, 2018. And we've got an intention, which is articulated in the Biosecurity Act 2019, that a biosecurity plan for the finfish farming industry be established and then enabled under regulations under that Act. It was intended for the biosecurity plan, through evidence we heard, to be operated or in operation by the end of 2021. Unfortunately, we also heard at that time that the evidence was presented that non-industry stakeholders had not been involved in the development of that biosecurity plan to date. I hope that as it's progressed further since that evidence was heard, that has been rectified. We did recommend that further expansion of the industry be postponed until the biosecurity plan was completed and regulations were implemented and applied to the current farming operations. Now, the government has stated its intention or its commitment to implementing the salmonid industry biosecurity program to be regulated and enforced under the Biosecurity Act. And I hear now through the government's response that the biosecurity regulations are due to be implemented by the end of this year, 2022. So we're getting there. It's obviously a process that's complex and takes time. I hope part of the delay has been more comprehensive consultation with a whole range of stakeholders. Madam Deputy President, I've taken some time looking at those matters under Term of Reference 1 because it's part of painting a picture of how we've travelled to where we are now. And I think one of the key messages I want to be iterating and reiterating here is that we have to acknowledge what's come before to best make use of and benefit from what we're doing now to set ourselves up for the future. I think the 2017 Salmon Industry Growth Plan showed that the government knew what the fundamental building blocks of industry expansion should be, but they lacked a good faith commitment at that time, I think, to ensuring those building blocks were in place before rushing ahead with supporting the industry with its expansion and growth. My overall impression in relation to that plan was one that it was something of lip service from the government in terms of engaging in good faith with the community, presenting information clearly and transparently, and showing that there was an evidence base for the intentions that it articulated. And I think that the formation of this inquiry in late 2019 was perhaps a bit of a speed hump that might have pulled government up short a bit and prompted a more considered approach, especially the pause on the new expansion of any new expansion in the industry until the next iteration of the growth plan could be developed. I think that is positive if that's the case. I'm pleased if that may have had some influence on that. I do think reflection on past process is important for us really improving and benefiting from present process. Madam Deputy President, Term of Reference 2 of this inquiry stated this: application of the Marine Farming Planning Act 1995 relating to A, preparation and approval processes for marine farming development plans, including modifications and amendments to marine farming development plans; B, allocation of leases, applications for and granting of leases; C, management of finfish farming operations with respect to the prevention of environmental harm. So, Madam Deputy President, marine-based finfish farming is principally planned, regulated and managed, as we've already heard, under the Marine Farming Planning Act 1995 and the Living Marine Resources Management Act 1995 and the Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act 1994. The legislative basis for the industry has to be regarded as the most fundamental building block to underpin a responsible approach to planning, development and effective regulation. With a sense of deja vu, I note that while the government is progressing with a review of the Living Marine Resources Management Act 1995 and the Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act of 1994, it's postponing a review of the Marine Farming Planning Act 1995. And yet, while it's postponing the review of that piece of legislation, it's pressing on with the next 10-year salmon plan, which will include expansion of the industry, which is governed under that Act. If there is recognition that the legislative instruments guiding the planning and approval of marine farming operations needs review and improvement, how can the government allow there to be any further expansion of the industry until work on its legislative foundation is complete? Under the Marine Farming Planning Act, we see a range of responsibilities and roles. The Minister has the ultimate decision-making discretion in relation to draft marine farming development plans and amendment plans, and is not required to follow recommendations of the Marine Farming Planning Review Panel. Finding of the inquiry was that there is a conflict, or perhaps at best the perception of a conflict, between the Minister's role in the promotion and development of finfish farming industry and the Minister's statutory responsibilities for planning and regulation of the industry under the Act. The EDO, the Environmental Defenders Office submission, made this point about the need for separation of governance arrangements for industry development and regulation. Strong decision-making, they said, requires independence as between the regulator and the promoter of an industry. That is one reason why we support the role of the Tasmanian EPA as a regulator of finfish farming. The inquiry requested and was provided with a helpful diagram which lays out the whole approval process for marine farming development plans and amendment plans. Those diagrams are included in the appendices of the report. And what you'll see if you take a look at them is that this is a very complex process with numerous steps and entities involved. It will be quite some piece of work to review and look at this piece of legislation. Evidence presented to the inquiry raised concerns about a number of elements relating to the process outlined. A lack of statutory requirement in the Marine Farming Planning Act for the Minister to make decisions based on scientific evidence. A lack of clear and specific criteria to guide decision-making by the Marine Farming Planning Review Panel, the Minister, the EPA Board or the Director of the EPA. The lack of legislative criteria relating to environmental outcomes, such as requirements for caps on biomass or nitrogen in either marine farming development plans or environmental licences. It was put to us that the Marine Farming Planning Act provides no defined framework to balance economic, social and environmental considerations, and that it's not clear how impacts, including on residents, tourism, recreation activities, are weighted in the marine farm planning process. Concerns were further raised that legislation does not require the consideration of integrated and cumulative impacts of marine farming on the marine environment and communities. And it was put to us that in evidence that other jurisdictions with intensive finfish farming industries such as Scotland, New Zealand and Norway have adopted a more integrated approach to marine farming planning. Now, within the constraints of the inquiry, we are not in a position to fully assess the right or wrong of any of those particular elements. What's clear to me and what my takeaway is from this discussion and this element was that there's a lack of confidence in the process that's there. There's a lack of confidence in its transparency, in its accountability, and in the involvement and say that the community get to have as part of the process. And so, as this is taken forward for consideration, if there is a review of the Act that then results in a review of the approval process for plans and amendment plans, that is what I would encourage the government to take away as a key message here. It might be that we could pick apart any suggestion that's been made in evidence to the inquiry by members of the public or by other independent experts about how to change or improve this process. That should be a comprehensive discussion that's held, and it should be held with the clear intent to build better confidence, transparency and accountability into it. The recommendation, I guess the key recommendation here that I'll just point to was recommendation 11, which recommended review of the Marine Farming Planning Act 1995, including the purpose and objectives of the Act, alignment with other legislated planning instruments, the role of the planning authority and powers of the Minister, membership, general functions and powers of the Marine Farming Planning Review Panel, stakeholder and public consultation, criteria for and discretion in decision-making, public release of information, access to appeal rights and merits review, lease allocation processes and recognition of community amenity. Now, that's a long list, Madam Deputy President. The intention of it is to point to the areas where there's currently contention or lack of confidence or questions over current process, and to encourage, within the context of reviewing that Act, when it comes about, that all those matters be well considered and well consulted. If that doesn't occur, what we'll find is a reviewed Act and the implementation of a new reviewed Act, and we'll run into the same issues of a lack of confidence and the same contention that arises as a result of that. I'm just going to find my place in my notes here. Within this process, there's a key role currently for the Marine Farming Planning Review Panel. The Marine Farming Planning Review Panel is a statutory body established under Section 8 of the Act. Its primary function is to consider draft marine farming development plans or draft marine farming development amendment plans and make recommendations to the Minister. The Marine Farming Planning Review Panel must perform its functions and exercise its powers in accordance with directions given by the Minister, and the panel is an advisory body, not a decision-making body. Under current legislation, it's not empowered to refuse or reject a draft marine farming development plan or draft marine farming development amendment plan. The Act itself was amended in 2011, resulting in changes to the decision-making powers of the Minister. It took away some decision-making powers from the panel prior to that and gave it to the Minister, is my understanding. The Marine Farming Planning Review Panel can... I won't go into that in too much detail. Suffice to say, this panel is a key part of the current approval process, and considerable concerns were raised in relation to the Marine Farming Planning Review Panel, including that it's neither fully independent nor broadly representative, that there's an inadequate mix of qualifications representation required under legislation, and highlighting that there's a perception that the panel to date has had a close relationship to industry, which is viewed as being advantageous to the interests of industry. Now, that's a shame, coming back here to some perceptions about the influence on decision-making and processes that are unfortunate because it undermines confidence. What we do know is that in times past, 2 additional members were selected to strengthen the expertise of the Marine Farming Review Panel during the assessment of the Storm Bay proposals, and those 2 members subsequently resigned. They highlighted on their resignation a range of issues, including a lack of statutory authority for the panel to refuse an application, concerns regarding the rigour of the application assessment process, and assertions that there was an inappropriate relationship with industry. In evidence to the inquiry, members of the panel review panel defended its decisions and its processes in relation to Storm Bay, defended its diligence in following legislative processes, and rejected those assertions made by those resigning members. It certainly wasn't appropriate in the context of this inquiry to adjudicate any elements of that dispute, but it was noted as a further indication that the legislation and the powers and configuration of the panel would benefit from prompt review prior to it being part of any further approval process to restore public confidence and to provide a clean slate. I do also note that when, in the context of hearings, I asked the department whether the resignation of those 2 well-credentialed and well-respected members of the panel and the criticisms that were made by them at their resignation, whether that had prompted some form of review, whether consideration was given as to whether the panel was appropriately configured and was able to fulfil its functions as a result of the criticisms made, or perhaps even whether some form of review and full consideration of those concerns was undertaken. And the answer that we received in those hearings was no, that hadn't prompted any review or consideration within the department. And I think that's a shame. I think that's a missed opportunity. Clearly, if you have 2 well-credentialed, well-respected members involved in a process who subsequently lose faith in that process and step away from it and publicly make known that they've done that, I would have thought a sensible course of action would have been some form of review to identify to what extent there was an opportunity to make improvements. I won't go in detail into the recommendations in the report that relate to the panel. Suffice to say that we've made some, but again, it comes down to a thoughtful review of that as one element of the approval process that's under the Act. And the government, in their response, points to the development of the 10-year salmon plan and the intention to then have a timetable to conduct a review of that Act. So that's something to look ahead to in terms of fruitfully progressing. I'm going to speak briefly about the EPA because within the course of the inquiry, concerns were raised relating to a perceived lack of independence of the EPA in times past and inadequate resourcing of the EPA to carry out all of its regulatory responsibilities with respect to finfish farming. Certainly the EPA's capacity to undertake long-term noise and water quality monitoring programs was reported to us as being inadequate and constrained by a lack of staffing and resources, and some of that was directly in information provided from the EPA itself, in particular in relation to noise. The Director of the EPA reports recovering from the industry close to 100% of direct management costs for current regulatory activities related to finfish farming. And yet, on the other hand, says that there's not enough resources and staffing necessarily to investigate noise complaints, which I'll speak about again in a little while. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. It's positive that regulatory costs are recouped from the industry. This is an industry that is making considerable profits from our public waterways. I would suggest that clearly there's an opportunity to recover from the industry regulatory levies at amount that is sufficient to not just fund the current apparently constrained functions of monitoring and compliance, but also what we could be regarded as a full and comprehensive regulatory monitoring and compliance regime to an exhaustive extent. I don't believe we can possibly have any suggestion levelled at us that our regulatory body for this industry does not have sufficient funding to undertake comprehensively its full functions in monitoring and compliance. And there's more to say about fees and levies in the next term of reference. Since the inquiry began, the government has separated the EPA from the department and is in the process of establishing it as a state authority under the State Service Act. The new agency is to be a separate legal entity. Mr Wes Ford, who was previously the director under its previous iteration, has been appointed as the Chief Executive Officer of that new to-be state authority and retains the statutory position of Director, Environmental Protection Authority. The government has put forward the intention to further strengthen the independence of the EPA through changes to the Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act. Those are out for public comment. It'll be interesting to see what happens. On the face of it, Madam Deputy President, this is a good development. Many have called for a more independent EPA. However, it's also potentially an example of a situation where the how is as important as the what. We need to look at whether this move to an independent EPA is actually going to deliver the intended outcomes or the desired outcomes from such a change. It's my understanding that after the announcement in designing the model of the EPA, there was no community consultation at that point in time. I know that other states that are focused on developing new independent EPAs have started as a starting point with a community vision on what an independent EPA could be and could deliver. That wasn't a starting point in this state. I think there's been something of a stark difference in approach with some of those other jurisdictions because they've undergone, as they remodelled their EPAs. I'm thinking here about Victoria, who, from my understanding, engaged in a great deal of consultation. I'm thinking of Queensland, who's currently consulting with the public on whether to move back to an independent EPA. In that process in Queensland, they're asking the public what they want from that. What outcome are they looking for from a move to an independent EPA? I'm not sure. My understanding is that in the draft act that was being prepared, there's no provision in regards to the director's independence, conflict of interest management, no change to how the director is appointed. I wonder, are we going to see change in any of the discretions of the director in relation to the finfish farming industry? I'm not sure what flow through that will be into that area. I guess the concern is that we risk making a cosmetic change, but really just extending the status quo. I'm hopeful that that's not what's playing out here. When I hear descriptions of processes in other jurisdictions that sound more open, more consultative, more focused on what the community wants and intends from this, I worry that that doesn't appear to be what we've undertaken here. So the report, Madam Deputy President, has some recommendations about independence of the EPA and some recommendations about the EPA being fully resourced to undertake its regulatory roles and responsibilities. And I know the government has some information around the increased funding to the EPA in this budget and into future budgets, and increased funding specifically that has been allocated to the management of the salmon industry, and that's pleasing to hear. It will remain to be seen if this addresses the issues which prompted the recommendation to be made in the report around increased funding. Will the EPA be able to undertake its full range of compliance and monitoring functions? Would we ever, I guess the test would be, if we were to have a future inquiry and the director of the EPA was sitting in front of us, would that person, he or she, be giving us an answer to a question saying, no, we don't have the resources to do that in terms of something fundamental to its role and function, which is what we heard on some elements to do with in this inquiry. Mr. President, matters relating to environmental licences were covered in the inquiry, and I'm not going to go into detail on those here, other than to point to them in relation to, for people who may have an interest in that area. Various concerns were raised relating to the current process of granting environmental licences, including a lack of opportunity for public involvement or appeal, a lack of transparent criteria for decision making. We'll move through those ones. My understanding from the government's response is that as part of processes around the new structure of the EPA and some of the establishment of new processes and standards involved there may well be some changes and some new requirements put in place. That will be pleasing if that begins to address some of the issues raised. Similarly, in the report, there's a section around allocation of leases. Again, here I won't go into detail around that, other than to point to the fact that issues were raised relating to the allocation of leases, particularly, I think, because of some rather stark comparisons that were drawn between the financial return that we achieve in Tasmania compared to the financial return achieved in some other international jurisdictions. So that's one aspect of the concerns. Other aspects related to processes involved and who gets first dibs, essentially, on lease areas as one issue. No doubt, as we move forward with the new 10-year plan and we move forward with review of the legislative basis of this industry, we may well address some of these issues relating to allocation of leases. I do note it was interesting to hear similar arguments made from both some environmental groups, but also from the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party submission. Some congruence there around the call for more open and transparent processes and a better financial return to the state. So I think that will be interesting to track the progress of the government's intention there. I do think, Mr. President, if I may, that given the contention around the approval of plans, the granting of leases, we'd be prompted to think about process and about those themes I mentioned at the outset. What would we expect of our system for approving fin-fish farming areas and allocating leases? I think there would be a reasonable expectation from the community that we would have processes that are free of political influence, processes that are based on transparent, independent scientific assessment, processes that include the full array of consideration of the full array of the uses and experiences relating to the waterways in question, processes that allowed for community participation and input, processes that were fully documented and accountable, that were reviewed fully within reasonable timeframes, that would achieve for our state the greatest financial return for the use of the shared resource of our public waterways, and that these plans and leases would be approved for and granted for an appropriate length of time to provide for the reassessment of the changing environmental and regulatory context that may eventuate. And I ask myself, if that is a reasonable expectation, which I think it should be for the community, is that what we have? And I think, Mr. President, if we look back at what's come before, we would have to say no. I don't believe that we've ever had that. Is that what we'll get under the changes that are being brought forward by the government now and the things that are in train? That remains to be seen. But I would point to that list as a bit of a checklist against which to assess how are we doing on any changes that we're proposing to make here. Fees and levies was an area that came up as concern, particularly in relation to the fact that not only would, of course, we want to perhaps collect fees and levies to the extent that we need to cover the cost to the state of regulating the industry. Of course, we would want to do that fully and comprehensively, but of course we'd also want to gain a return for the use of our public waterways. And many submissions and evidence at hearings called for this. They pointed, many of them, to other jurisdictions that achieved much greater returns and made comparisons about what Tasmania could achieve if we were to apply similar regimes. Now, be that as it may, we are a place unto ourselves, and it's up to us as a state to determine what's appropriate. I would hope to think that our government would have first and foremost at the forefront of its mind the best interests of our community in determining what return to achieve for leasing areas of our public waterways and recouping not just costs but benefits above that from this industry. We made a recommendation 40, which was to ensure that appropriate returns to the Tasmanian Community Commission commission an independent review of fee and levy structures for fin-fish farming, including lease value and its reassessment over time, setting of lease fees, rates of levies required to fully fund regulatory monitoring, compliance and enforcement activities, and local government rates as relevant to the industry. Now, I'm really pleased to see that through the development of the salmon plan and as part of processes of updating these arrangements, the government is intending to look and commence a review of the fee and levy structure for the industry. The review apparently is initially considering the costs of services to regulate and support the industry, but also, I would hope, to achieve an appropriate return to our state, and Treasury and Finance are involved in doing that. I welcome this wholeheartedly. I hope that we see it deliver an outstanding result for our state. Again, it'll be one we look for, and it remains to be seen about whether the intent of the recommendation that we've put there is delivered on. The last part of term of reference 2, Mr President, related to environmental harm and the management of environmental harm. And I'd say from the outset that we heard quite clearly from industry operators that they regard measures taken to minimise environmental harm in relation to their operations to be highly regulated through federal and state legislation, supported by robust industry policies and practices and validated by third-party accreditation. That was a very clear message, and there certainly was a great deal of evidence that pointed to those elements. Industry representatives also acknowledged quite clearly the need for continual improvement to be sustainable and demonstrated a willingness to adapt their operations to minimise environmental harm and could point to instances and examples of doing so. I'd point readers of the report to a section which outlines measures taken by the finfish farming operators to minimise environmental harm. It's quite informative in that sense. The submission that we received from the department also pointed to legislation and regulation requirements for the industry, including management controls on a range of issues, environmental surveys and assessments, requirements for marine farming licence and environmental licences, baseline surveys, reporting, monitoring and compliance requirements. And the submission said this framework ensures that the impacts on the marine environment from the production of salmonids with respect to both solid and soluble wastes are limited to a level that can be assimilated without unacceptable environmental harm. So the department was pointing to the processes there and making the claim that they work. And yet, Mr President, concerns regarding environmental harm were a feature of many, many submissions received by the inquiry. Others, some of the submissions came from respected independent scientists and experts. Others were from concerned community members, written from a personal experience and observation. And some, to be honest, are very upsetting to read. They painted a picture of what I would regard as distress at times from a range of community members from different areas of the state, from different backgrounds, who've observed environmental changes and damage that they attribute to finfish farming. It cannot be ignored, Mr President. It cannot be ignored. There are hundreds, likely thousands of Tasmanians who believe their local environment and their lives have been made worse by the impact of fish farming. Issues and concerns that they raise included visual amenity, noise, light, marine debris, ecosystem and habitat modifications, impacts on wildlife, nutrient loading, water quality and cumulative environmental impacts over time. I think I can pull out one example which summarised I think a number of the community raised issues relating to finfish farming, and it was from a submission from the Tasman Peninsula Marine Protection Group from Trish Bailey. It was said this: these submissions express the anguish of issues such as a loss of amenity, a lack of social licence for the salmon companies to operate, the lack of transparency in the industry and poor public consultation. These issues include noise and light pollution, the endless debris problem along our shorelines, the algal blooms that have washed great royals of green filamentous algae up on our beaches, docks and shorelines, smothered healthy seagrass beds and seaweed colonies, compromising valuable habitats for marine life and destroying favourite recreational areas for swimming, fishing, kayaking, etc. Concerns were raised, Mr President, that the current regulatory regime is not adequate to manage the environmental impacts of the finfish farming industry, and that regulation has failed to keep pace with the expansion of the industry, as I mentioned earlier. The Tasmanian Conservation Trust submission expressed this concern regarding the legislative framework. They said this: the industry has been going through a rapid expansion in recent years. The regulatory controls have proven to be grossly inadequate, and the state government and industry have failed to respond to community concerns. Chris Wells, I quoted earlier, he's an aquaculture planning consultant, noted in his submission the initial environmental harm caused by the industry was low. However, the regulation failed to keep pace with the expansion and growth. He said this: there was never any serious attempt in this state to address site selection criteria, such as water depth, water movement, fallowing to enable dispersal of nutrients loaded from farming activity, Instead, legislation was passed fast-tracking salmon farming development, bypassing normal planning processes. This very poor start to the industry did not immediately cause problems in the environment because farms were small, pens were small, and stocking densities limited. Leases were granted in areas of little tidal movement that were conveniently located for business owners, and the business of salmon farming begun. As the years went by, pens became larger, biomass of fish increased, and companies invested in the ASX. As this occurred, nothing changed in terms of regulation by state governments, and local governments were bypassed. The marine environments were compromised by large-scale farming, overstocking becoming the norm to increase profits. And the regulators at the PIPWE and later EPA turned a blind eye to problems. I think that's probably not a fair assessment, Mr. President. I think that doesn't capture efforts and changes that were made by government and regulators over time. But I do think it's fair, stepping back from that, to say that there was some catch-up being played and that we didn't adequately keep pace. And that is why we do see, through these submissions and in the community currently, a great deal of concern about harm caused. I think the very fact that now we have a flurry of activity putting in place an environmental standard, a biosecurity plan, a review of the legislation underpinning this industry and these activities, a whole range of new measures coming into play over the next little while. The very fact of that acknowledges that we didn't have those to an appropriate degree previously. We simply didn't. And that's why we've arrived with some damage caused, with some consternation in the community, and the distress that has gone along with that. Mr. President, the report does touch on a number of concerns raised in relation to the use of freshwater resources by the finfish farming industry and the lack of a comprehensive audit or review of those resources that are used, and the apparent absence of clear and equitable water strategy for the state that would govern that. I think that I won't go into that in detail in the contribution today, other than to point to its place in the report and some recommendations made in relation to it. I note that the government, in their response to the report, has suggested that as part of consideration of the new 10-year salmon plan, there's an intention to propose to phase out flow-through systems for all freshwater salmonid fish farms over a certain size. This will involve, they say, working with industry to establish timeframes for transition of existing flow-through systems to fully recirculating systems. Mr. President, that's something that I welcome. I think that's something that we heard quite clearly in the inquiry as a concern, that rather than all freshwater systems being the top-notch RAS systems, that we still had some flow-through systems which people understood to be less than best practice. So I think it's an excellent move to propose to phase those out. Of course, we have to remember it's not just what, it's also how. So it's a matter of when's that going to happen. It says here over a certain size. Well, that will be a question about what's the appropriate size in which that requirement will come into play. What will that then leave us in terms of flow-through systems? So there's a lot of questions still around that, but I do welcome the intent of it and the recognition that that's an issue that has been raised and a concern that has been raised. Mr. President, another area that came up in relation to environmental harm was around penalties and enforcement. It was noted that penalties for breach of environmental regulations are set at lower levels than in some jurisdictions. And that, of course, was relating to concerns raised that penalties applied to the finfish farming industry for breach of environmental regulations weren't adequate to act as a genuine deterrent. And of course, that's what we need them to be. It needs to be not worth the while of industry operators to break the law and to step outside environmental regulations. If that's something that they can afford to do as a cost of doing business, then that's problematic, and we need to address it. That was expressed quite effectively, I think, by Environment Tasmania in its submission, where it said, currently penalties for breach of regulation fail to discourage ongoing intentional regulatory breaches. It's more financially lucrative for operators to breach regulations than comply with them. And I think, Mr. President, if I may, the fact that we now have this industry operating in the state owned by multinational companies will be even more likely as a state to want to require quite significant penalties and enforcement for any environmental harms caused, given that we do hear reports of breaches of those matters in other jurisdictions where these companies operate. We'd want to be on the front foot of looking after our natural environment here. So a number of recommendations appear in the report relating to a review of penalties and the scope of liability in regulation that genuinely reflect the potential serious environmental consequences and strengthen that deterrent effect. The government does point again to consideration of this in the 10-year salmon plan and the intention to develop a timetable for review of penalties and compliance frameworks. So again, that's something I welcome. It's good to see that intention stated. We will see where that ends up and whether we have some improvement and resolution. It's another wait and see in my view. We do have an environmental standard, I believe, coming soon. That was initially mentioned in the 2017 Salmon Growth Plan, the EPA developing an environmental standard to provide consistent, more rigorous and comprehensive approaches to environmental management of the industry. It's quite outstanding and disturbing, really, to think about the fact that we've come this far with this industry without something as robust and definitive to be guiding our approach to it. Once implemented, that standard should provide greater public confidence in environmental management and accountability of the industry. But again, it's not just about what you do, it's about how you do it. So we've already had some concerns raised that community and stakeholder groups were excluded from the development of the environmental standard. I'm hopeful that as that process has progressed more recently, that is something that has been rectified. I'll be interested to hear from stakeholders around their experience of engaging with that project. The government may have updates on that. I do believe that we've got perhaps even a consultation open now on the environmental standard. And alongside that, we've got also consultation occurring on the proposed amendments to EMPCA. And of course, the piece of legislation really underpins the environmental standard, because I think that the objects of what the standard has to achieve and be should be outlined in that legislation. So I'm hoping that those two things are being progressed in a way that's cohesive and connected, and that we end up with that standard in place to become that robust backbone to how we approach things, and we can hold people to account for it. Industry can be held to account to it, but also we can hold our regulator and the operations of its compliance and monitoring functions to account around that standard once it's implemented. A great deal of discussion was, I guess, generated in the inquiry, and I'm not going to delve into it in great detail here, but it was around the concepts of adaptive management versus a precautionary principle. There's a lot of information in the report that I would point people to. It is, I think, really interesting to consider appropriate approaches and the way in which both those approaches are applied or brought to bear in the context of this state. I think that there's a lot of genuine concern about an adaptive management approach being applied here in this industry without appropriate evidence-based and scientific understandings to begin with, that we sort of launch in with an adaptive management approach before we're in a position to effectively and responsibly have that work for us. I did note some descriptions that were really useful in understanding what an adaptive management approach is and what's required for it to work well. And I can see why that there is concern that that is something we may not have well in place at times, that it's been applied in this state. So again, I'm not going to delve into it in detail, but I point people to that conversation, and I think it should be an ongoing conversation about the appropriateness of approach taken, particularly in relation to this area of environmental harm and how we're preventing that, and to what degree we're responsibly in a position to understand the environmental impacts as they play out if we haven't got the evidence base at the starting point. That doesn't do justice to the full conversation around those topics, but again, it's a long report, Mr. President. And this is a long contribution, I know. Let me move on. Term of reference 3, the final term of reference in the report, is that catch-all that we typically have in our inquiry processes. Any other matter incidental thereto. Many other matters came up that were incidental thereto in the course of this inquiry, Mr. President. And we've outlined a number of the key ones that we felt were important to note in the report. I'm going to mention a couple of them here. Some of them turned out to be areas of very distinct interest and quite clear concern. One of the key ones that I'm going to speak to in a little detail is around marine debris. And of course this does connect back to that previous idea of environmental harm, I would imagine, but it's a good distinct one to look at in its own right. The issue of marine debris resulting from finfish farming activity was a matter of significant concern, Mr. President, including safety risks, environmental impact, and the potential for debris to be increasing as the industry expands further. Now, it is acknowledged that not all marine debris is produced by finfish farming operations, and that extreme weather and high energy offshore sites present ongoing challenges. What I'm going to say here though, Mr. President, is that that's always thrown into the mix. Yes, but finfish farming doesn't create all marine debris. And yes, of course, that's true. In the same way that we also hear in relation to nutrient loading in certain areas, well, it's not just finfish farming that's nutrient loading into those areas, it might be other agricultural processes or other processes in the local area. Of course, that's true too. But in terms of the nutrient loading in some cases, and in terms of the marine debris, we can't get away from the fact that there's significant evidence that the finfish farming industry is the main contributor of that debris in this case, and in some cases the nutrient loading of areas. Just because there are other contributors doesn't mean that we don't have a conversation about finfish farming and its place, and it doesn't mean that we should contemplate doing anything less in trying to alleviate the issue in terms of finfish farming. I believe that some of the submissions we received really clearly outlined the extent of the debris problem that's been identified by local communities, proximate, but also in some cases not overly proximate to fish farming operations. Some of the things we heard, I'll just give a couple of examples. We heard from a submission from a citizen, an individual, Susan Wardle. Debris is regularly collected, which we dispose of at our own cost, as there is no rubbish collection on Bruny Island. an economic concern for a lot of people, but also this raises environmental and safety concerns. As reported publicly, during a strong storm, a pen washed away completely. This would have been a danger for small craft and swimmers. Storm Bay is called Storm Bay for a reason. It's no longer acceptable to deal with pollution and debris by simply letting the tide take it away, as seems to have been the methodology here. And we heard from groups on the Tasman Peninsula, the Tasman Peninsula Marine Protection Group. The beaches are becoming littered with debris from fish farms. Many locals now go to the beaches armed with bags to collect the bits of rope and plastic washed ashore. Literally, trailer loads of the debris have been delivered back to Tassal on a regular basis. Not only is this trash unsightly, but the plastics that remain in the ocean are broken down into microplastics, which are consumed by marine organisms and hence enter the whole food chain and marine ecosystem. Very large pieces of debris, including metres of plastic pipe and rope, have been reported to mast floating in Storm Bay and associated waterways, major hazards to recreational and commercial boaters. Now, Mr President, in that 2017 Salmon Industry Growth Plan, there was a statement around a zero tolerance approach to marine debris. But I would have to say that that's an on-paper commitment in many instances. It's virtually meaningless to have said we have a zero tolerance approach to marine debris. It's impossible to have comprehensively implemented such a thing, and it's certainly not clear in any evidence presented how or if or the degree to which it has been enforced. What we do know is that we've had a number of efforts made, though, through industry. Industry has put in place a voluntary code that they developed in terms of marine debris, including the development of a marine debris hotline and debris tracker app. However, neither the department nor the Tasmanian Salmonid Growers Association were able to confirm how the effectiveness of the zero tolerance policy or the voluntary code the industry developed would be measured. How will we know if we're doing better? How will we know if this is working? What meaningfully are we measuring to say we're working towards zero? Concerns were expressed in relation to the Debris Tracker app, including a lack of input from community into its development, the appropriateness of its operation by industry, and no requirement to report the data collected, either publicly or to government at that time. Fin fish farming operators were identifying and reducing marine debris through the use of tracking technology, colour coding, marking of equipment, staff education, rope recycling stations, collection bins and shoreline cleanups. That was all reported to us of really positive efforts being made within industry to reduce marine debris. However, what that tells us is those efforts coming into play at that point in time meant that they weren't necessarily in play before that. And so it's not surprising that we're still seeing a lot of historical result of marine debris, and it's hard for us to gauge to what extent we're improving, I believe. We're now, at least I think, through that tracking technology, through the colour coding and marking, doing better at identifying equipment, and that's incredibly important because marine debris infringement notices, Mr President, can only be issued where ownership of debris can be identified, leading to a very limited number of infringement notices actually being issued because previously those markings and that those tracking elements weren't there. Marine debris infringement notices, it was reported to us, are not publicly reported, and the penalties are regarded as insufficient to act as an appropriate deterrent by many. According to the Neighbours of Fish Farm submission, the issue of marine debris is not taken sufficiently seriously for the authorities to record the incidence and frequency of occurrence or levy penalties for creating waste and hazard, nor for the companies to institute rigorous methods that should prevent debris in the first place. Now, that's a claim made by a community group. I think evidence from the industry says that there are measures that they are taking. I don't think that they're exhaustive measures. I think we're still seeing an issue here with marine debris, and there's still improvement required. I think there's a lack of public information and promotion of the mechanisms for reporting marine debris. I thought one suggestion that came through a submission, again from Neighbours of Fish Farms, was actually a good one. They said There should not be a boat ramp, beach or accessible waterfront fish farming area without clear signs advertising where to report marine debris. Further, there needs to be a system that makes it easy to report debris on water or on shore to an authority that collects statistics and reports regularly to Parliament and the public. How otherwise can the public even start to monitor the size and extent of the problem of marine debris, and how can government and regulators effectively monitor and manage the problem? I think those are reasonable points to make. Some progress occurred during the course of the inquiry, which was reported back to us the second time the department came to hearings. At that second appearance, the then Acting Secretary, Tim Baker, appeared before the subcommittee, this was October 2020, and said this: "The first thing on my list is that all floating marine equipment is now required to be uniquely marked and can be traced back to the operator. And based largely on a conversation we had here, we have established a single point of reference for responding to notifications of marine debris, and that system was developed in consultation with MAST, Friends of Bruni and the companies themselves." Very, very positive to hear a development reported back to us in the inquiry, during the course of the inquiry, based on prompting through the submissions, I think, and the messages that were heard and the questions that had previously been asked. So there's recommendations made in the report, Mr President, around marine debris and where to from here in terms of a marine debris policy. Recommendation 55 is to develop a fin fish farming industry marine debris policy in consultation with community and other stakeholders that can be effectively implemented, monitored, enforced and reported on publicly. There's some other recommendations too. I do note that the government, again, points to its in development 10-year salmon plan as being the context in which they may well address this issue again. I hope that it's a more purposeful approach that's outlined in that, beyond the zero tolerance approach that was expressed in the 2017 original plan. That one didn't necessarily tangibly play out to be accountable, to be monitored accountably. I wonder, I wonder about infringements, and I wonder about the penalties applied to them and whether there's a great deal we could improve there. I think more identifiable equipment is going to help with that, but it will remain to be seen whether we get a change in what's experienced in communities who are the ones using shorelines and encountering this debris. Mr President, I do note that the government has said that the question of ongoing responsibility, effectiveness and matters relating to the app and the hotline will be addressed in the process of updating the marine debris policy going forward. So again, it's a wait and see. We'll see if that arrives at a spot that sees tangible improvement if we're out on the shoreline of Bruny Island or the Tasman Peninsula or wherever it might be. One of the final things I'd like to point to, but it's another issue of significance that I'd like to spend a moment on, Mr President, is the issue of noise and light in relation to this industry. Noise and light are issues that are specifically problematic in relation to the inshore fin fish farming operations, I would say. Fin fish operations that are close to the shore and close to residences are likely to negatively impact on community amenity with noise and lights. This is even more likely due to the fact that some of these inshore farming operations are in locations that are beautiful, peaceful, appealing places that Tasmanians have chosen to live specifically for the natural environment around them. Within the course of the inquiry, we heard very clearly from many, many submissions that noise and light generated by the industry has caused significant distress and has a negative impact on the health and wellbeing of community members. And I'm going to mention a few of those, I'm going to quote a few of those directly so that their voices are heard here. Firstly, from a resident in Calora on Bruni. We think of social impact being about our ability to enjoy the unique amenity offered by the Coolora coast. The residents were there before Tassal, and Tassal should accommodate the residents, not the other way round. I have major concerns. Breaches are still occurring. Multiple noise complaints from Coolora residents concerning lease machinery, attendant vessels. We have fought hard over nearly 20 years to limit the noise and light pollution from Tassal's Shepherd lease, yet breaches continue. The system relies too much on residents complaining before action happens, rather than Tassal ensuring that all machinery is silenced before it comes near the site. And another resident of North Bruny said this: my neighbours and I are repeatedly being impacted by the noise from marine fish farm service vessel movements transiting between the Doncaster Channel, northwestern Storm Bays. The noise, a low drone or deep throbbing, can be heard during the quiet periods of music and during the muted ads on the television, even with the windows and doors closed. It penetrates habitable rooms and disturbs sleep. The opening between the channel and Storm Bay is 1.6 kilometres narrow. Vessels are therefore in close proximity to residential houses at Dens Point and Tinderbox. Vessels are often within 300 metres of the shoreline. Many incidents occur at antisocial hours between 6 p.m. and 7 a.m. And a resident of North West Bay said this: Huon Aquaculture has assured us on many occasions that their vessels operate within noise regulation guidelines. However, the low-frequency drone of the engines and hydraulic equipment that can go on for hours is very distressing. It can be heard through our double-glazed windows and has on occasion caused the windows to rattle and pictures on the wall to shake. During the warmer months, we prefer to have the windows open, which causes much more distress. The vessel's movement can occur at any time of the day or night. Recently, a vessel towed a pond liner into the jetty at midnight. Bright lights from the vessel shone in through our windows and was accompanied by shouting and loud engine noises. Mr. President, it can go on and on. And in the report, we include a number of these stories from personal experience from all many different areas that are proximate to inshore farming operations. One of them, or some of them, describe the health impacts and wellbeing impacts of the noises that are experienced. And some of them raise concerns about the impact, not just on residents, but also on tourists and tourism operations in nearby areas. I think that this is yet another situation relating to this industry which has been allowed by government to become a point of contention and has fuelled bad relations between industry and communities. In relation to noise, the fin fish farming industry is required to operate within a regulatory framework, legislated by government, monitored and enforced, apparently, by the EPA. While decibel levels might be set in regulation, the impact of noise can also be related to tone, frequency, regularity, and the time of occurrence, which are not regulated currently. In response to noise complaints, the EPA stated to us that it does little monitoring of industry-generated noise and would require additional resources to increase its monitoring function. For example, in the case of North Bruny, through questioning in our hearings, we discovered or received information from Wes Ford, the Director of the EPA, that in September 2020, that although, and this was in hearings in September 2020, that although the noise complaints in relation to North Bruny fish farming operations made to both the EPA and to the company directly had escalated over the previous 18 months due to the fact that a second lease area had been brought back into operation, the EPA had not undertaken any monitoring to assess the situation. 18 months, no monitoring. But in fact, Mr. President, on further questioning, it turns out that no noise monitoring had been done in that area undertaken during the 5.5 years that Mr. Ford had been Director of the EPA, nor, to his knowledge, he told us, had there been any undertaken in more than a decade. So this is disturbing. We've had complaints reported to us that there have been complaints made around noise in these areas for extended periods of time, for over a decade, and yet no monitoring to assess the validity of those complaints or to assess the compliance of the industry who are there. And apparently, according to the EPA, that's to some extent a resource issue. Mr. President, there's various avenues for making complaints in relation to finfish farming noise. However, there's no central collation or public reporting of those complaints, so there wasn't at the time that we took the evidence. In response to complaints, finfish farming operators report they have made efforts to reduce noise through adjustments to operations and improvements to equipment. And indeed, often residents are suggested to make the complaints directly to the companies and to try to negotiate and work with them around changes and adjustments. It was confirmed in some submissions from community members who described that at times over the years, direct discussions with the industry operators had resulted in changes being made, such as modifications to equipment, alterations to schedules and instructions to staff. However, this has only delivered improvement to a point. It also requires community members becoming distressed enough to reach the level of complaining, which can be quite a confronting thing for people to do. And as there have been as well as requiring community members to reach that threshold of complaint and the distress that builds up towards that, it also requires that there be some actual change the operator can offer that's practical and that they deem won't be too detrimental to their operations and can be applied. So there's only certain circumstances under which that's going to be fruitful. And as there's been technological developments over time, some noise and light issues have been resolved through those developments, but then others have also cropped up. So we've got an ongoing issue here. I was struck by a comment made by the EPA Director, Mr Ford, in the hearings in relation to noise complaints and the difficulty in judging how significant an issue it is. He said this: "The challenge in trying to deal with those sorts of things is unravelling how many individuals, where they're located and what might be driving any particular complaint on any given night. Why does one person complain and the other 20 or 50 people who live nearby not complain? We don't know the answers to those sorts of things." Well, Mr President, in thinking on that, I can tell you it was pretty clear to me from the evidence to this inquiry that if I were a community member living close to one of these inshore farming operations who had been making noise complaints for over a decade, which had resulted in absolutely zero monitoring by the EPA to assess and respond to my complaint, I'd be overwhelmingly likely to just give up. Abject helplessness and hopelessness is what I'd likely be feeling in that situation. It's also clear to me that there will always be some people with the confidence and capacity to make complaints when a situation that they are subjected to, which is detrimental to their well-being and amenity, occurs. And there will always be some other people who, despite being similarly affected, will be unable or unwilling to take the step of complaining. In terms of noise complaints relating to fish farming operations, I believe there is more than enough evidence in the public domain through complaints records and the evidence to this inquiry to entirely dispel any suggestion that complaints may be due to one or two vexatious individuals while all other residents in an area are blissfully unaffected and unconcerned. If complaints in an area are coming from a few key people, the likelihood is that it's because they have taken on a representative role for their neighbours or communities and have the capability and resilience to continue to seek a resolution to the harm being experienced in their community. Further to that, Mr President, I'm also left wondering how many people being affected does it take for a regulator to respond to a complaint? Where is the bar set for the industry regulator to engage in monitoring and enforcement functions that it holds? Local residents already feel in many ways that they're in a David and Goliath battle to have their voices heard on matters to do with this industry. And quite frankly, Mr President, I think this issue around noise and lights is another classic and clear issue where inshore fish farming operations are the most problematic, demonstrably so. It's very hard to imagine that if we had a clean slate and were planning the presence of this as a major high-tech industry in our state from the start, we would ever have put these intensive farming operations on our inshore public waterways in such close proximity to local residences and communities. They were placed there in times past when the industry was vastly different to what it is today, and it would appear that we have no mechanism by which there's a full reassessment of the appropriateness and desirability of approving such operations now in a continuing way in these environmentally and socially sensitive locations. We do hear in the evidence of this report that the EPA regards matters relating to noise could be further codified in the environmental standard that's currently being developed. Wes Ford, the director of the EPA, confirmed that. He said, "We're certainly looking at noise in terms of how to incorporate noise into the standard, because noise is part of current licence conditions incorporated in the old marine farming licences. We're revisiting noise in terms of a condition within an environmental licence." Mr. President, the EPA identified that lighting is difficult to regulate, and it's not clear actually at this time whether lights will be included in the environmental standard currently being developed. So again, the government's response to the report does point to, you guessed it, that this is an issue that's being given further consideration in the 10-year salmon plan. And again, as I have before, I'll welcome that at face value that that's the case. It does mean it's an intention. It's not something we can measure or assess or see whether it's coming to fruition to address the issues that are there. So it's another wait and see. I think some progress has been made through the newly independent EPA around hotline for complaints and notifications, and that's now being dealt with a bit differently to what was reported to us initially. So again, if that's progress and that's something that community members see as fruitful and beneficial, I'd applaud it. I think we've yet to have that demonstrated. There's recommendations in the report, Mr. President, around matters to do with noise and lights and how they may be dealt with. And again, I hope those things are looked at and considered fully as the salmon plan is taken forward, and these matters apparently are to come within it. One last matter to mention from the term of reference 3, Mr. President, and again it warrants mentioning because it was represented substantially in evidence presented to us as a concern, and that's around seal management. I'll just mention that briefly here and point people to the report for a more full exploration of the evidence presented, our considerations around findings and recommendations on this matter. Clearly, the issue of how we manage interactions with wildlife, including seals as a significant example, is one of interest and at times concern in the communities, particularly in relation to seals because of the use of deterrent devices. That was raised as an ongoing concern in the inquiry. We heard that the practice of seal relocation has been phased out since 2017, but the seal management framework that has been in place allows for special permits to capture, hold and relocate seals in certain circumstances. So there's still some of that may be happening. I believe it's reported on. And now there are, I guess, a focus of concern in relation to seals is around the use of deterrents and whether that is the explosive devices, the seal crackers as they're colloquially known, or whether it's the lead shots that are used, the bean bags, which sounds friendly, but certainly not friendly to receive a beanbag full of lead, I would think. It's called a deterrent for a reason. These are matters which we felt strongly need to be reviewed and assessed, including the efficacy and safety of all seal management devices and transparent public reporting of their use in the public domain. The seal management framework requires review, and I believe in the government's response that what we have is an intention, again, in connection with the 10-year salmon plan, to look at that. That there is an intention or a proposal that there be a new aquaculture standard for wildlife interactions, which would replace and modernise the current seal management framework. So again, I welcome that intention. It's needed, and now it will be a matter of we'll wait and see how that plays out. And again, what I will do is point back to the themes that I mentioned right earlier on in my contribution. Those themes around independence, transparency, accountability, community involvement and participation. With all these things, all these matters in train that are stated by the government as an intention to be addressed through various mechanisms, we need to see those matters include transparency, independence, accountability, community involvement and participation, and the others. Without that, what we'll end up doing is moving the furniture around on this industry and the regulatory framework that sits around it, moving the furniture around and arriving at exactly the same position we're in now, 5 or 10 years down the track, where communities have not seen the outcomes of greater transparency, greater accountability and greater participation, where they haven't had the opportunity for, the industry hasn't had an opportunity for a social licence to be genuinely built. And that would be a great shame indeed, Mr. President. What I'm quite interested to hear, having seen the response from the government and having in my contribution today welcomed many aspects of it, with the corollary of that wait and see. It's a good intention expressed, we'll wait and see how it plays out. What I do want to know is whether the government thinks that the steps it's taking now, the plans it's making for this industry, the mechanisms that it's putting in place, does the government think this will resolve to a significant extent the community distress and concern that's been generated under its planning and regulation regimes to date? And if so, on what basis does the government think or feel that it can make a commitment that it will do so? In my view, I think the government clearly sees the need for reform and is undertaking it quite actively. It would be an incredible shame for this to be, in some sense, just a readjustment and a reformalising of the status quo, particularly the negative aspects that are there for the community. We need a reset. We need that reset to not just be fixing things on paper, not just be getting the pieces lined up properly. It needs to be about how we do it. We need to do it in a way that's healing and restorative. We need to ensure that we don't see the same issues that are plaguing us now in relation to this industry perpetuated. The Tasmanian community, Mr. President, including those involved in this industry, deserve that outcome. So I'll conclude my remarks on that note and thank members for their patience in staying with me through this contribution. I did want to do justice to the fact that this has been an extensive inquiry. It is a large piece of work, and many people out there in the community and in the industry and in the departments, the relevant departments, have all given of their time and contributed so generously. And I certainly want to ensure that we do justice to that, not only in the report that's been tabled, but in our noting of it today. So on that note, I note the report.
The question is that the report be considered and noted. The Honourable Member for Hobart.